Lovely that you can join us this afternoon. Thank you so much for your time. I don't want you all worrying about taking copious notes or anything like that. As usual, you'll get a copy of the slides and you'll get a link to the recording that will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel. So it's more important that you listen, to be honest, and maybe read the slides as we're going through. This is a kind of update webinar to a webinar that we originally did on digital product passports. I think going back to, God, it might be May last year, maybe June last year. So a lot of the information that I'm sharing with you today, albeit the EU hasn't moved forward that much in terms of the delegated acts and some of the implementation guidelines that we need. Some of the information I'm sharing with you today is based on global trade departments' own work in this area, because obviously we're going to be offering our clients the ability to build their digital product passports with our platform. So we've had to do a lot of work around, what does that look like and what kind of data do we need to be able to have them store and make available to the various different actors that need to see that digital product passport data. So hopefully it's useful, but again, the EU hasn't really moved that much further forward at the moment, but I'll share with you what we know to date. As always, I've pulled together an agenda, so we'll just have a quick review about what are digital product passports, what's their purpose, what's the EU trying to achieve through introducing these passports. What's the regulatory basis? So as with everything that I seem to talk to you about at the moment, there's a raft of regulation that forms the foundation of the Commission's decision, and digital product passports are no different. So I'll cover off some of that. We'll talk about how they're going to be implemented, and we'll talk about part of the EU's ambition at the moment is to use batteries, the digital product passport for batteries, as kind of like the blueprint to test the passport before it's rolled out to other wider products, if you like, as per the working plan 2025 and 2030. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the data deep dive is the bit where you're just going to have to sit back and think she's going to send us a copy of the recording, because I've given you a lot of information, not so much on the screen, but I will kind of like do a deep dive into certain areas, because what I've done is broken down digital product passport data by view. So into the three core actors, which are essentially the consumer, the market surveillance authorities, and then customs authorities. And I'll go through how they're all seeing kind of generally the same data, but either in greater detail or, at a higher level and so on. It should become a bit clearer, but hopefully that might help steer your minds towards the kind of data that you need to start capturing now on your product to make sure that you can provide that via the digital product passport when your products come within scope. We'll talk a little bit about the data architecture. That's more for guys that are building their own digital product passports, or for companies like Global Trade Department that are going to build them on behalf of our customers. We are going to have to adhere to very strict standards, and hallelujah, we're going to be regulated, which is something that we have been, because we're also an authorized representative, right? We've been lobbying government, basically saying, when is somebody going to regulate authorized representatives, because we keep our clients compliant but nobody actually checks on us. So brilliant with digital product passports. Anybody providing that is going to be basically have to adhere to very strict standards, and they will be kind of like regulated in some fashion. We'll talk a little bit about the impacted economic operators. So how does it impact on manufacturers, importers, distributors, resellers, and so on. And then how is compliance with digital product passports and the wider regulation that it sits under, i.e. the Eco Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, or ESPR, how do authorities enforce that? What are the market surveillance measures that are going to be placed to make sure that everybody's compliant? And then, as I always do, just to try and make sure that the EU doesn't get an unfair rap on this, yes, the EU, as I always say, is at the forefront of regulation, especially sustainability regulation. and it can feel a little bit burdensome. But when you put it alongside other global regulation, and you realize actually that other global markets, your other potential or existing export markets, are actually moving in the same direction, you realize that actually the body of work that you're doing for compliance with the EU is going to stand you in very good stead for complying with other markets as well, because that's the general trajectory of travel. And then we'll talk a bit about planning for compliance. What should you be doing? And hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. So what are digital product passports? So I've given you the Commission's definition, if you like, a digital product-specific record that stores and shares sustainability, circularity, and compliance information to a whole body of different actors, be they consumers, businesses in the distribution chain, upstream manufacturers, upstream suppliers, customs authorities, market surveillance authorities. And the core characteristics are they must be linked to a unique product identifier. And those of you that have worked with Global Trade Department on general product safety regulation compliance, you'll be familiar with that unique product identifier. We talk about it a lot. And it must be, the digital product passport must be machine readable and interoperable. So for Global Trade Department, we're focusing on a QR code, but there are other equivalent digital carriers that if you're building your own, you might want to use. And they have to be accessible at different levels. So I almost think about different permissions for consumers, businesses, market surveillance and customs authorities. There hasn't been a huge amount of kind of noise made about how customs are going to use DPPs. But if you think about the EU's longer term objective to digitize international trade entirely, and the UK was on a similar trajectory until last year when it paused its development of the single trade window. This is going to be game changing for customs authorities, right? They're going to be able to access all of that clearance information that they need from the product itself, and also do that initial first check on regulatory compliance that they're duty bound to do on behalf of the market surveillance authorities. So it's quite a game changer for customs as well. I've just given a very quick list here of the data that a DPP might contain, but actually we go into a lot more detail in subsequent slides. So moving on, regulatory basis. I really don't want to get too bogged down in this, but you hear me talk a lot about the European Green Deal. And that's the EU's big, hairy, audacious goal of being the first climate neutral continent by 2050, right? So launched by President von der Leyen in 2019 and allegedly in response to EU citizens' call for climate action, essentially. It has several different goals to it. So you might have heard in some of your reading or your research Fit for 35, which is the EU wanting to reduce certain carbon emissions by 2035, and then they've got even bigger goals by 2040. I think they want to cut emissions by 90% by 2040. So it's a pretty big objective. And the idea is that the EU enjoys cleaner air, more energy efficient products, more energy efficient homes, and more renewable energy sources. Now, there's a plethora of acts and legislation that sit underneath that I'm not going to go into too much detail about. But the Green Deal, the European Green Deal, is really at the heart of all of the EU's sustainability regulation, whether we talk about ESPR or the packaging waste or extended producer responsibility or corporate sustainability due diligence reporting. All of that regulation is basically triggered by the Green Deal. The Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation really aligns itself to the EU Circular Economy Action Plan of 2020. So that's one of the major building blocks of the Green Deal, if I'm honest, and it includes initiatives to address the entire life cycle of a product. So how products are designed, how waste is prevented, how used resources are kept in the EU economy for as long as possible. It really covers, the ESPR is really regulation that governs a product from its inception, from its design, product and its packaging right the way through to its end of life, and perhaps recycling or, rejuvenation and whatever we call it. Oh God, I'm wearing somebody else's teeth again this morning. Um, Refurbished, that kind of thing. So the eco design for sustainable products is a big piece of regulation that governs digital product passports. It's really the core bit, if I'm totally honest. And then the Circular Economy Act, that is all about making the EU the leader in the circular economy by 2030. So the EU is trying to reduce its dependence on virgin materials and have products and packaging based on recycled materials, if you like. So they want to cut significantly the amount of product and packaging that is sent to landfill. Now, the Eco Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, that is actually um, what do you call, an update of the Eco Design for Sustainable Products Directive. Okay, so the ESPD, as we called it, focused just on energy related products. So electrical goods, batteries, that kind of thing, although batteries are mainly covered by battery regulation, but kind of like electrical goods and electronics. And what it does is it has obviously transformed that directive into regulation, which you've heard me talk about the difference between a directive and a regulation before. It becomes more directly applicable across all 27 member states. So there's less potential for regulatory scope creep as different member states transpose the legislation into their national law, if you like. And it also makes it clear that it uses those WE goods to build upon, and actually the digital product passport will eventually apply to all goods on the EU market. So every product sold into the EU or made in the EU will have a digital product passport. So that's the Circular Economy Action Plan and the Eco Design Directive. And then the working plan. So obviously, you've heard me talk before about regulation and how the EU implements it. And that's usually by delegated acts. So those delegated acts are what we call implementation guidelines, okay? And we've got a list of delegated acts that we're expecting to come through that link directly to digital product passports, and I'll go through those in detail. But the working plan of 2025 and 2030 was the EU's way of communicating to economic operators the kind of schedule for implementing ESPR, and it included the initial products that are going to be within scope. So iron, steel, aluminium, they're intermediate products, but then finished products would be tires, furniture, mattresses, textiles, excluding footwear at the moment. And then there are others that are kind of floating around the periphery, which are kind of like chemicals, detergents, and so on and so forth. But the working plan 2025 to 2030, those of you that want to read it, that gives you kind of like the schedule of how the EU is going to implement ESPR, and as a result implement DPPs. Those delegated acts I'll go through with you in a separate slide. And essentially, so the EU's message, or what it's trying to achieve, is products should be designed to last longer, be easier to repair and recycle, and contain fewer substances of concern. So if you have been on our YouTube channel, you'll see that we have done webinars in the past around the updates to REACH regulation, which cover those substances of concern and what direction the EU is going to either outright ban or restrict those substances of concern. There is also webinar material on there about the Right to Repair Directive, and that kind of fits with this. And also the Product Liability Directive is on there as well. So there's other webinar content on our YouTube channel that kind of help piece all of this together. But fundamentally, it's about making sure that a product is designed from beginning to end with recyclability in mind, and reducing harmful substances that can harm human health and also the environment, and so on. And there's lots of moving parts, right? Because EU regulation is being updated all the time. So ESPR kind of sits at the heart, but it links to REACH regulation, restriction on harmful substances regulation, links to lots of different bits. But, you know, when we know, we kind of let you know as well. So don't panic. How will they be implemented? So I've kind of mentioned these delegated acts. I've given a bit of a timeline down the right-hand side here. But just to go through some of them in a little bit more detail. So we've got what we refer to as product-specific delegated acts. So they are the delegated acts that will focus on, say, iron and steel, and then there'll be one for aluminium, and then there'll be one for textiles, and so on. So thinking about iron and steel, actually, there's preparatory work underway at the moment for the iron and steel delegated act. We're expecting adoption by late this year, at least for the first wave. And then, as with every piece of EU regulation, there's an 18-month transition period. So we wouldn't see, you know, full application until, what would that be, 27, sometime in 28, if you like. But it's a big one for the EU because obviously aluminium, steel, iron, they're all carbon intensive products and manufacturing processes that the EU is trying to cut down on. Textiles is one that we get contacted about the most. We have a big kind of like community of fashion and textile kind of businesses that use our services for one thing or another. Again, the preparatory work is underway at the moment. Textiles obviously have not the best sustainability record. You know, I think I read a stat a couple of years ago that 1% of textiles at some point was recycled, and the rest was just, you know, sent to landfill. So it's not got the best. Don't quote me on that, but it was something I read, not necessarily a reliable source, but it was just one of those things I pick up. We're expecting adoption of that act early next year, which would give a hard implementation of kind of late 28, maybe 29. But the Commission obviously identifies textiles as being a real top priority because they see it as a sector that has high environmental impact. Okay. Furniture is a little bit later. So again, preparatory work ongoing. What do I mean by that? They do several different studies. They engage industry. There's a lot of different studies and research go into EU regulation. And even once the regulation has been adopted and, you know, is out there, they still continue to gauge what the feedback is like. So we're seeing that at the moment with the EU deforestation regulation. There's a study underway at the minute that's open to the public or industry to feedback on whether or not leather goods should be included in the scope of the EU Deforestation Act. So they continue to monitor implementation and the impact that it's having on businesses, and sometimes amend the regulation accordingly. But furniture, we're not expecting a hard implementation deadline until about 2029, even maybe 2030 for furniture. That will include both household and office furniture, so kind of business and consumer. Mattresses, expected hard application 2030, so adoption of the Delegated Act probably sometime in 2028. Mattresses are dealt with as a subcategory of furniture, but they are kind of like singled out with their own Delegated Act. Tires, another one. So there's preparatory work underway at the minute. We're expecting a Delegated Act next year, 2027, which will mean that the kind of hard implementation date or application date will be kind of like 2028. Stroke 2029, and that's really focusing on durability, microplastics, and recyclability of mattresses. And then there are other delegated acts that cover energy related products that are already covered in the eco design for sustainability Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Directive. So things like dishwashers, refrigerators, EV chargers, and so on. If you went into the kitchen and looked at your dishwasher or whatever, it would have one of those stickers on around energy performance and so on. Those products are already part of kind of like a semi-digital product passport, but will become fully compliant with the digital product passport under the ESPR regulation. And we're expecting delegated acts anytime between now and 2028 for those. So we'll keep you in the know for that. And then the really important horizontal, so delegated acts. So those acts that or those requirements that span all of these different products, they're super important because they are what will give us that what I would class as sustainability scores against each product. So one of the first ones is repairability requirements. That's a horizontal requirement, which will form part of your first digital product passport. So we're expecting the adoption of that act early next year. So hard implementation would be kind of like 2028, 29. And that will basically require manufacturers to provide a repairability score against the product, which will be calculated using criteria that the EU will notify via the Delegated Act. They'll have to list spare parts availability on the digital product passport and any disassembly rules as well. So that's probably the repairability requirement is the first horizontal delegated act that we'd expect through. And then the second one is the recyclability and recycled content horizontal delegated act. And that really concerns electronics. The focus is on electronic goods. So we're expecting that next year with a hard implementation, late 28, 29. And that will be kind of like electronic and electronic equipment, material recovery standards. And it's that kind of like full disclosure will be required as part of the digital product passports. And then there's other ones which probably don't really affect UK companies as much, which is like the green public procurement requirement. So the EU is keen to where it's public bodies in the EU have to procure from businesses, that those businesses will have to be compliant with the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation and so on. So there is a delegated act that outlines public procurement requirements under the Green Deal. And then we're expecting a specific digital product passport delegated act, which we're desperate to get a hold of just to make sure that the homework we've been doing is right, or have we gone overboard, or is there stuff that we've missed? So that will give us the full list of rules governing the digital product passport system. And it will give those service providers like Global Trade Department the guidance that we need to help our clients develop these passports. The consultation started last year, and we're expecting adoption of that delegated act later this year, stroke early next year. So it's really important because it will give companies like ourselves that are doing it on behalf of our clients, or companies that are doing their own digital product passports and are just seeking to have a service provider host the backup. It will give them the data storage model. It will give them the access rights. It will give them certification criteria for those service providers. And that's kind of like the horizontal act that governs the implementation of digital product passports. So there's a lot going on in terms of that, but as they are adopted, then we'll just do an update to this webinar and make sure that you understand what they all mean. Okay. I mentioned before that the batteries are really serving as the guinea pigs here. So the battery digital product passport is going to be used as the blueprint for digital product passports for wider products. So battery manufacturers have already had to start disclosing their carbon footprint data basically from February this year. So they will have been managing their scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, for example. And from February next year, each battery will have its own digital product passport that you'll be able to basically access via whatever, whether it's a QR code or something like that. So you'll be able to access firsthand that data that maybe you have to put on your own products. When the delegated act comes in that governs your products. Why did batteries come first? Exactly as I say, high climate impact, critical raw materials are used in the manufacturing of batteries, and they have complex cross-border supply chains as well, in terms of not just the product itself, but the disposal of that product in the different EPR systems across the EU. So the EU Commission is basically using batteries as a proof of concept for the digital product passport. Now, DPP components. So as I've mentioned before, a key pillar of the ESPR, or the Eco Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, is the digital product passport, and it has four main purposes. I would argue probably five, but the first one would be kind of like having manufacturers use these, what I call R strategies, down the right hand side. If manufacturers are encouraged to use those R strategies, then it enables a circular economy. It boosts material and energy efficiency. It extends product lifetimes, which is what the EU wants, and optimizes product use as consumers can reuse products, or products are refurbished, and so on. And then the second purpose would be for businesses. So if businesses are provided with more relevant and readily available product information, they're able to better implement service and repair-based business models as well, which obviously tie into the whole circular economy ambition of the EU. And then if consumers have ready access to a brand's sustainability credentials and performance, they can see the true impact of their purchases, and they can make better informed purchasing decisions. They might choose to buy a different brand because actually that brand's impact on the environment is less than their brand that they've been using for years. And then the fourth one is really around market surveillance authorities. So if those kind of auditors or competent authorities have readily available information to evaluate and verify a product's compliance, DPPs act as kind of like a record of the standards that the product has to comply with. So that whole product compliance becomes a lot tighter, which is what the EU wants. We've seen a lot of focus on that with the introduction of GPSR in 2024, and then the update of some of the harmonized safety regulation, like the Toy Directive, Machinery Directive, Construction Products Regulation, and so on, of late. And then the fifth one that I would add, which isn't really talked about an awful lot, would be DPPs eventually will provide customs with kind of unprecedented digital data to aid customs clearance, right? They'll be able to scan a product and see everything they need, from the commodity code to all sorts of stuff that they need on your typical import or export declaration. And that supports the EU's wider ambition of fully digitizing international trade, right? Which is what we hoped the EU was going to be doing also, the UK was going to be doing also, but we seem to have paused that for the moment. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to crack on with these ones. I'm going to do the deep dive. So the first one we're going to talk about is the consumer view, right? Okay, so imagine your consumer picks up your product, they've got their smartphone, they scan the QR code on your product. What are they expecting to see? So this is just based on Global Trade Department's kind of research to date. It's not based on the delegated act for digital product passports, but they would expect to see basic product identification. Okay, so making sure that they can kind of clearly identify the product and what it is. So they'd expect to see the product name and model, the brand or the manufacturer, the unique product identifier, so like that serial number or batch number. They'd expect to see the product category. So, is it textiles? Is it electronics? Is it batteries? And then the country of manufacturer. So the origin. Okay. So that's what you would expect at the basic product identification. And remember, it's a delicate balance with consumers, because you want to make sure that they've got the right information to make the right choices, but without overwhelming them. So we see digital product passports as having a lot of kind of visual representation, pictograms, harmonized codes for certain things, just to make it a little bit easier and not too overwhelming in terms of text. Obviously, digital product passports, if you're selling into the EU across all member states, then they're going to have multilingual variants as well. So the less we can rely on text, the better. The other thing that consumers are going to want to see is that sustainability and environmental impact. Okay, so core to the DPP is helping consumers understand what the environmental footprint is of the product that they're buying. So we would expect, in terms of footprint indicators, and you're not going to have all of this from day one, so don't go panicking. This is about starting to prepare the data now to get ready for when you're going to need it, but you're not going to have it all from day one. And that's the beauty of having kind of like that online repository that can be updated frequently. Okay, but you'd expect to see carbon footprint, so kind of like the CO2 equivalent per product, energy use across its lifetime, from inception to reaching the market, water usage in the production stage, land use if relevant, so textiles, agricultural based materials, and then pollution indicators, so any air, water or soil impacts. And then sustainability ratings or labels. So the EU Eco Label, I've presented on this before, that's a kind of long-standing kite standard in the EU that you can adhere to and have on your products. So you might have access to the EU Eco Label or some kind of equivalent certification. Then you'd have your product environmental performance score, if that's standardized as part of the digital product passport, and then your compliance with those eco design requirements. Now, where the digital product passport and some of the delegated acts will be helpful is when we're talking about circularity indicators, we need to know kind of like, what do they want us to show in terms of recycled content percentage? And also, what data do we need to maintain in-house to be able to certify that the kind of claims that we're making are correct? The renewable percentage of the renewable material percentage and the resource efficiency score. They're all kind of things that we could go to existing standards around circularity and start making our own, but I kind of think it would be better to wait for the delegated act and clear implementation guidelines from the EU before going to that effort. Material composition is something that consumers need to see, but not as much as market surveillance authorities need to see. So, you would need to be transparent about what the product's made of, which lots of you are probably doing already. So, a list of the main materials like cotton, or is it aluminium, is it lithium, and then a percentage breakdown of that material. And presence of recycled material or bio-based material. You need to disclose any kind of substances of concern or hazardous substances, so chemicals of concern that would be listed in REACH regulation, any safety warnings related to materials, and then the presence of critical raw materials, so those rare earth elements in electronics that we find. That's all information that we need to make available to the consumer if your product actually has those materials. And then the durability and performance, that really helps customers to evaluate a product's longevity and quality. So you might disclose the expected lifespan of the product in terms of years or usage cycles. You'd have a durability rating if the EU standardizes that, which would be good. Resistance indicators, so water resistance, wear resistance, and so on. Definitely performance metrics, so energy efficiency class for appliances or battery capacity and degradation rate. And then you'd have your warranty duration on there as well. So you can already see there's a lot more information that you can put linked to the product, which actually can deepen the consumer's kind of emotional connection with your brand over and above what you can put on the product's pack, or even in a manual, because nobody reads the manual usually. And with digital product passports, we've got the opportunity to be a lot more creative about how we present this data. Repairability and maintenance. So a key focus, as I've mentioned, of the Commission is enabling repair over replacement. Okay, so it wants manufacturers to offer repair services and promote that first over and above just simply sending out a replacement product. So you'd have your repairability score index, which will be part of what the EU communicates via a delegated act, the availability of spare parts, the availability duration of those spare parts. Those spare parts are going to be available for 7 years or 10 years, and then your ease of disassembly rating. All of these, again, are you're not going to have them from day one. It's something that you build upon. Reuse, refurbishment, and second life. So again, the EU focuses on product reuse and secondary markets. So you might want to disclose whether the product is suitable for reuse and refurbishment, any refurbishment guidelines, resale certification or grading, history of repairs for those second-hand products. Now, what's really important, and this kind of links the digital product passport not just to the product itself, but to its packaging as well. So the end of life and recycling information, that really links the digital product passport with not just ESPR, but the packaging and packaging waste regulation and the extended producer responsibility legislation. So the idea is that the information that's given on the DPP helps consumers dispose of the products responsibly. So it ties in with those other pieces of regulation. So you'd have kind of like your recycling instructions step by step, or links, for example, collection schemes for or electronics, take back programs for manufacturers or retailers, material recovery information. So what can be recycled, what cannot, and any hazard warnings for disposal, like batteries. So a lot of the problem that the EU is facing at the minute in terms of recycling at scale is the pollution of waste streams. So manufacturers have to get a little bit more savvy about giving consumers the exact guidelines for how to get rid of that waste, so that it's done responsibly and correctly, so that that pollution of waste streams is reduced significantly. Compliance and regulatory information. So absolutely all that safety information. If you're saying that your product, is governed by the machinery directive or the toy directive, then it needs to carry the CE mark. So the CE mark could be there. You would list the regulation that it complies with. So the eco design, REACH regulation, restriction of harmful substances, and then you'd have any product safety certifications, any kind of, anything that adds to the credibility that the product is safe. Now, you've heard me talk about supply chain transparency and traceability back to source, and that is a founding principle of so much EU regulation now. But consumers don't need to see that in a huge amount of detail. They need to see a simplified view of it, and definitely non-sensitive information. So they might want to see the country of key production stages. So, you're saying the origin is, I don't know, origin of the product is China, but were there any other sub-production or sub-processing taken place elsewhere? And then as part of that supply chain disclosure, you'd want to be making sure that you had your ethical sourcing claims. So any fair labor certifications, any conflict-free materials, fair trade statements, anything like that. And obviously all of this stuff is stuff that in-house you need to be able to certify. If you're making those claims, you need to be able to substantiate them. So some of this is going to be going back to your supply chain partners and asking for their documentation so that you can substantiate your sustainability claims. And then you have product specific data by product category, really. So, if you're dealing with electronics or batteries, you'd have the battery health status, you'd have charging cycles, so on. If it's textiles, you'd probably have fiber composition, washing impact guidance, color fastness, shrinking properties, that kind of stuff. And if it's furniture, you might have the wood origin and the FSC certification, maybe any chemical treatments used, and so on. And then the other thing is, how do you encourage consumers to extend the product life cycle? Well, you do that by providing action-oriented insights. So how to extend product life tips. best way to recycle this product locally, energy saving usage recommendations, that kind of stuff. Now, in terms of the design, I don't want to go into too much detail, but essentially, fundamentally, it needs to be, all of this data needs to be accessed via a smartphone. So QR code scanned via a code, sorry. It needs to be multilingual if you're selling into more than one country in the EU. And there's even an argument for, we don't know fully yet until we get the delegated act, but because you won't necessarily know where the product is going to end up, say it's sold secondhand, then there might be an argument for having all 24 official EU language variants of the digital product passport available. Needs to be compliant with the EU's Accessibility Act, so have those accessibility features, those interactive elements like expandable sections, visual life cycle maps, personalized tips based on usage, all that kind of stuff. All the kind of stuff that we're used to seeing on apps now. We now need to kind of take those apps and stamp them on our products. Just in the interest of time, because I'm going to dip into the next one. So I'll skim through some of this. So unique identification and traceability, obviously that I'm being told I've got 15, so I am going to go through this in a lot more speed. So what do I want to tell you about this? Unique identification and traceability. So to market surveillance authorities, they need to be able to identify the product, but they need more detailed information than the consumer does. So they'd still need, say, the unique identifier of the product, but they might need the batch or the lot number. They might need the global trade item number, or the GTIN, as you're familiar with, or the EAN, the European article number. They might see the customs code links. They'd want to know a little bit more about the manufacturer and the authorized representative it's there. So you would want to see, full details for the manufacturer, so legal entity, address, contact, and the same for the authorized representative, any importer details, and then the access to supply chain actor roles. So those kind of like structured identifiers, like IORI numbers of those other actors within the supply chain. What else? When we get to materials and chemical composition, so market surveillance authorities need to see a lot more in a lot more detail. So they might want to see or have a link to the full bill of materials, the BOM for that product, okay, and the material composition at component level, so that percentage breakdown. They'd want to see more information about those substances of very high concern under REACH regulation. So the exact substance identification via its CAS number, the concentration levels, and so on. Those of you that have used us for GPSR compliance or harmonized safety regulation compliance, you'll be familiar with providing all of this kind of stuff anyway. So in many respects, you're taking your technical file for the product safety elements, and you're making it available via a digital product passport. So all of that regulation that you're complying with, be it ROSH or REACH or anything like that, would be available to market surveillance authorities, but consumers wouldn't see it and customs wouldn't need to see it. It would also have your declaration of conformity, all of your CE marking documentation, your notified body involvement. If you have a notified body test your products where you don't do self-assessment of safety in-house, then your notified body details would be within the DPP. You'd have your full set of regulatory compliance, so ESPR, REACH, ROSH, battery regulation if applicable, waste directives, and so on. And then you would have supporting evidence. So just as you do in the technical file for your product safety, you'd have your test reports, like your lab reports if you have those done. You'd have any certification documents for those third-party audits. Essentially, your technical file just becomes available via the digital product passport for those market surveillance authorities only, if you like. Product performance and eco design parameters, again, the consumer has seen a very high level view and seen what they are probably interested in. But with market surveillance authorities, they're going to be looking more at the detailed technical data used to verify the claims. So, what are the energy efficiency metrics? What's the resource efficiency data? What are your test methodologies applied? If you've done any durability tests, what are the mechanical stress tests, life cycle test data, that kind of thing. And then repairability, pretty much the same, but they would want to see where you are promoting kind of repairability. They'd want to see your pricing structure, or your, not necessarily pricing structure, but your methodology for making sure that pricing is fair, and that pricing for repairing product is feasible, okay, and that the spare parts are available. And they'd want to see that kind of the same kind of information that you give to your professional repairers and independent repairers that you're promoting that can repair your goods. They'd want to see what data you'd be giving them. I'm just going through some of this really, really quickly. What else did I want to mention to you? One element, just looking at the designs, the audit trail and data governance is going to be really good. You'll know that when we do with GPSR, if we have our clients do a product safety risk assessment, they always have to date it and sign it, because it's that point in time. So there's going to be a lot of kind of like audit trail and data governance as part of DPP. So it just makes sure that that data that is being provided to consumers or the market surveillance authorities or customs is reliable and traceable. So it would be things like timestamp data entries, version history of the digital product passport, the data provider identity, so who uploaded what and when, verification status, was it self-declared or third-party verified, and then big use of digital signatures and authentication credentials. So that's really important, and we talk about that a lot with our clients around technical files. Has been a kind of snapshot of compliance at that given point in time. Access control and confidential data. So obviously we've talked about how some digital product passport data is restricted to authorities only. So anything that concerns those upstream manufacturers or upstream suppliers, those supplier contracts, those kind of sensitive formulations and so on, they wouldn't be available to customs or your consumer. That would be very definitely just the market surveillance authorities. So it's having that ability to control access and having those confidential data layers that is probably the most challenging part for service providers like ourselves, and that's why we're waiting to get further steer from the EU as to what technology we align ourselves with. And then big one is interoperability. So if you imagine these digital product passports have to be visible to, or have to be accessed via customs systems, or have to integrate with customs systems, market surveillance databases, other databases like ECHA, the European Chemicals regulatory database. So the technology that's used has to be interoperable and accessible via lots of different kind of like systems that need to access that data over and beyond the consumer's smartphone. Finally, customs authorities view. So we don't talk so much about customs and the benefits that they're going to get from the digital product passports, but it's going to be huge. So again, they're going to want to identify the product, but they're going to be looking more at the product name and description that you would normally put on a customs declaration. They're going to be looking at the HS code or the tariff code. They're going to be looking at anything that, origin of the product, anything that goes on your standard import or export declaration. And really the purpose being because it helps them validate customs declarations and enables that kind of automated classification and tariff application. They're going to want details around the economic operators and the trade actors. So, the manufacturers, that the consignor is the, who's the importer, the consignee, that kind of stuff. Is there an authorized representative in place? Obviously, to govern preferential trade rules and agreements, then they need to know the origin of products. But they become more able to check the origin of products. So we won't be able to just say, well, we made it in the UK, or you know, we packed it in the UK, therefore it's UK origin. No, it's not. We'll have to probably have links to our origin calculators, our bill of materials, and so on, so that they can validate that the origin declaration is correct and that we are correctly claiming preferential status when the product is being imported into the destination market. What else? Regulatory compliance status. Obviously, as I say a lot, customs are the eyes and ears of market surveillance authorities. So they need to see at a certain level, a deeper level than the consumer, but not as deep as the market surveillance authorities, your kind of certification or validation of the regulations and standards that you comply with. So as you know, each regulation has its standards that you align with, which governs the kind of design, manufacture and testing of your product. They need to see that, but not in as much detail as the market surveillance authorities. They need to know about restricted or harmful substances. Obviously, you know, we're not talking about dangerous goods here, but they need to see whether there are any kind of like, you know, harmful substances that are subject to certain regulation, and make sure that that's how it is. On an import or an export declaration, you will usually have there's a what used to be box 40 on the old C88. You would have kind of like statements of, you know, whether a product needed an export license or whether a product was subject to this regulation or whatever. So it's still very relevant to customs authorities. Yada yada. What else do I want to mention? No, let's just skip on. Essentially, that it's going to be ground changing or for customs authorities, and it means that their reliance on market surveillance authorities will lessen, because at the minute customs often have to refer kind of like queries that they might have to market surveillance authorities. That holds the clearance of the product up, whereas they're going to be able to access all of the information that they need from the product and not have to refer so frequently to market surveillance authorities before clearing it in the EU. Let's skip over this because we don't have the detail yet, and you've got these slides anyway. Impacted economic operators, obviously, you know, the burden of responsibility or the burden of obligation lies with manufacturers over and above. But then, as with everything in EU regulation now, that compliance burden is shared with other players downstream. So there are obligations on the part of importers, authorised representatives, distributors to check digital product passports to make sure that they are compliant and that they contain all of the information that they need to before they are placed on the market. How are they enforced? So essentially, border checks, customs verification, that's the first thing. Market surveillance authority audits, so, you know, the likes of trading standards going in and actually, I'm sorry, somebody look at my desk. Market surveillance authorities doing audits, making sure that products that they sample test have digital product passports, what the kind of data is available via those passports. So they'd be your equivalent of trading standards going into an importer's warehouse in the EU or a distributor's warehouse in the EU, or even a shop or a reseller in the EU. The marketplaces, so your online marketplaces like Amazon, eBay, Etsy, have a big responsibility with digital product passports. They need to check once they're kind of in place and the regulation, you know, past the hard application date, they need to make sure that each product that is sold via their marketplace, via their platform, has a digital product passport. Global perspective, read this at your leisure, but basically the trajectory of travel is that most global markets are moving towards some form of data that's accessible via a QR code or something on their product that talks around design for circularity, sustainability credentials and so on of products so that consumers can make more informed decisions, so that market surveillance authorities can enforce regulatory compliance, and so that customs can go fully digitized. But just go through those at your leisure. It stands, as I always say, nothing is as robust or extensive as the EU's regulation. But interestingly enough, China is the one that is adhering to the likes of ESPR most closely out of everybody. So it's going to be interesting to see the development in their regulation moving forward, and actually see those digital product passports come through on products that we purchase from China, because they're very much aligning themselves with the EU in that respect. I'm just going to skip over that. I'm going to go to questions because I'm conscious that there will be some. I'm okay for a couple of minutes.